Good evening, dear students and colleagues. I'm very glad to welcome our guest, Professor Endrjū Čestermana, an outstanding translation studies scholar whose theories have inspired research and provided the theoretical background for numerous translators educated all over the world, and also here in Latvia, and also at the University of Latvia. Professor Čestermana is an author of the famous Memes of Translation, a book that is also translated by the group of second-year students here at this university. And I'm very glad that Professor Čestermana has agreed to give a series of talks about his work here at the University of Latvia, and I'm very grateful to the translation agency Euroscript Baltic, whose support has allowed us to materialize our dream of having Endrjū here again. You are very welcome, Endrjū, here. But before I give the floor to you, I'll give the floor to the translation agency Euroscript Baltic director, Therese Rosenberg.
Thank you. Yes, I'm the managing director of Euroscript Baltic, and I'm very happy to see you all here. Hopefully we'll be joined by some more people as we go along. Well, Euroscript has been a part of the translations business for almost 30 years, 12 of which we have been here in Riga. During these years, we have sort of played the part of a Latvian host family to more than 100 translators. And these translators have been from various cultures and nationalities, but they have had one thing in common. Well, I mean, more than, in addition to being translators, they have also, all of them, had the love of learning. And our knowledge-hungry translators Thank you. Where would we be without technology? So our knowledge-hungry translators essentially gave us the idea or inspired us. They kept telling us that they are interested in lectures, seminars, workshops, and this kind of provided us with the incentive to do something about this. As we have been successfully collaborating with the University of Latvia for more than 5 years now, this was the next logical step. So we're very proud to support and sponsor these series of lectures on translations, and hopefully these are the first of many to come. So without any further ado, I'm very, very pleased to be here tonight to welcome our speaker, author of more than 100 publications, if I'm not mistaken, and professor of translations, and a very distinguished personality, Mr. Endrjū Čestermana. So welcome.
Well, it's always very embarrassing to start talking after such incredibly unrealistic introductions. But I do want to say thank you to my hosts here at the University of Latvia for inviting me. It's about my third or fourth visit, I think, to Riga, and it's always great to come. I think the town is just lovely, and I've got some good friends here. And I also want to thank the company that you just heard for sponsoring this visit. It's a very generous effort, and I appreciate it very much, as I'm sure my hosts do as well. I was asked to give two talks, and the first one will be a bit more theoretical, and then tomorrow I will try to be a bit more practical. and then you can see whether you think there's a difference. Before I start, I'll just tell you if I speak like this, can you hear me all right? Okay, good. Then I won't need to sit down, maybe. Is that okay? Or do you want to use this? Oh, you've lost me. Well, I'm here. I mean, oh, you have. Okay, good. So that's better, isn't it? Okay, put it in there. Hello. I'll just roughly tell you a few things about how this first talk will go. I'm going to start by... Sorry again. Sorry. Now that sounds distinctly different. Take it out again. All right, there we go. Put it back in again. Okay. Right. Now we can hear. I can even hear myself now. Okay, wonderful. I'm going to start by talking for a few minutes about the importance of the actual concept of a hypothesis. I want to say some things about it which I think are important not only for scholars of translation but also for translators. And then we shall move along to look at some examples of both empirical hypotheses that have been proposed about translation and then different kinds of hypotheses which I call interpretive ones, which have to do with concepts. And we will end up by, after looking at some examples of those, we will end up by asking some questions about what makes a good hypothesis, what makes a hypothesis particularly interesting, and why hypotheses are important. Okay, I'll start off with a very simple definition, which is this, that a hypothesis is a good guess at the best answer to a question. It's based on a guess which is based on evidence and logic, and it's a guess that will be tested. That means that a hypothesis is not a fact. It's a guess, hopefully a good guess. Here is my favorite example of a hypothesis, going back to Darwin. This is a famous page in his notebook. I hope you all keep notebooks. Very important, sort of an intellectual journal. And this is where, for one of the first times, he sketched what he thought might be the family tree of man, with the monkeys and all the various other things going farther back. You probably know roughly what I mean, I hope. And at the top of this, in the top left-hand corner, he writes, "I think." I love that, because he's not sure. It's a guess. He's studied mountains of evidence. He's thought, he's read, he's discussed with people, and he has an idea which might be a good one. And he's not sure. He didn't call this a hypothesis, but it is, in fact, a hypothesis, because he's not sure. And if you ever have a chance, when your studies are all finished and you've got a real nice holiday and you've got a month on the beach somewhere, take to read Darwin's Descent of Man, or The Origin of Species. And you will find in these books that he constantly stresses the fact that he's not sure. And more than that, he constantly stresses the kind of evidence which would prove him wrong. So he says, if such and such and such and such is one day discovered, then my theory is wrong. That's exactly how we should proceed, I think. Now, this idea that knowledge was not necessarily certain is not very old. We've only been accustomed to thinking about this for about 200 years or so, which was quite interesting. It's part of the late development of the big scientific revolution that started back in the Renaissance, you might say. Because before we had this idea that knowledge could be mistaken, it was not sure, it was assumed that knowledge, by definition, was something that was sure, certain, either because it came from revelation from God, or it came from deduction, logically following from some theory, or it came but via generalization from some inductive process. And people only began to realize that they needed some concept of knowledge which they could not be sure about when certain other ideas came to influence the way they were thinking. I'll give you two examples. One is Descartes. Descartes' metaphor of the clock. Descartes believed, or suggested, shall we say, that nature was like a big clock, the surface of a big clock. And we can only see the surface of this clock. But in order to know how it works, we have to make some guesses about what happens beneath the surface. We don't know what's beneath the surface. We can only experiment and guess. And we can also remember that even way back in ancient Greece, there was the idea that matter consisted of little tiny particles, which we now probably call atoms or molecules or quarks or whatever there are inside quarks, I forget. But of course, the ancient Greeks couldn't see atoms, and let alone being able to see inside an atom. So this was also a kind of hypothesis. You have some ancient Greek, I forget who it was now, who believed or argued that this is the way matter is formed. He could not possibly know this as a certain fact. So we are in the realm of a hypothesis yet again. So what the hypothesis does is to bring in the idea that knowledge is fallible. And I think it would be fair to say that for most scientists and scholars today, I would like to say most true scientists and scholars, if they have the idea that knowledge is certain, that maybe they're not really in the world of science at all. They're in some other world. It's not a truly scientific way to think. We have to think, if we are doing science, that we may be wrong. Okay, so if a hypothesis is a good answer to a question, what kind of questions can we ask? I think there are two big sorts. Some are empirical, which might be quite general, exploratory ones. For example, what do you think the answer is to this question? Do people recognize translations? If you give people 20 texts and you say, 10 of these are translations, 10 of them are not. Please tell me the translations, which has been done several times in different languages. Well, do people recognize them or not? Yes, good point. Let's assume that they're all published and they're all kind of okay quality. They're not nonsense. Well, the answer apparently is sometimes, but not always, which is interesting, because sometimes you may think something is a translation and it isn't. So why? One wonders. Interesting. And sometimes you might think that something is not a translation when it is. And this leads to all kinds of further research experiments and so on. So that's a very simple question, okay? Do people recognize a translation? We don't know, is the answer, really. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, which is curiously interesting. Sometimes the questions can be more formal, more focused. For example, if you study Finnish audio-visual translations these days, and you compare them to what they were like 10, 15 years ago, you will notice that the quality has gone down. Why? Guesses? Partly, but there are more important reasons. Any other guesses? Partly, but there are more important reasons than that too. There's one very big reason, which is a social reason. No. The social reason is as follows. The big employers who want audiovisual translations, like film companies and TV companies, are paying less and less money because they want to save money, which means that last year, for example, this crisis climaxed in the fact that about 50% of the professional Finnish audiovisual translators went on strike. They refused to work. They walked out. Whereupon, the TV companies simply invited various students to come in and help at half the price. And you can guess the result. Sometimes the question can be really quite specific. For example, is it true that translations tend to have less lexical variety than non-translated texts? Are translations actually simpler? And the answer to that seems to be yes, pretty much. It's a pretty general tendency. Not for every translation, but it's a very general tendency. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. More empirical questions. What's the best way to translate? Any answers? We'll come back to that next year, right? Depends on too many things, of course, okay? How do you translate culture-bound terms? Well, there have been lots and lots of proposals. They're very practical questions. What are the various strategies that you might use? More on that tomorrow. How to make the best use of machine translation? How many of you professional translators use Google Translate? And if not, why not? Because increasingly, in many countries, people are beginning to use Google Translate to give you a first version in about 1 second, and then you edit it, and you can be faster. That's not good news for people who train translators. Sorry. But it's unfortunately what is largely happening. Translators in many industries are becoming post-editors. Do you do courses in post-editing? We are beginning to think that we should do such courses and encourage students to be faster by generating a machine translation and then post-editing it. It's a very different skill. How should we raise the status of translators? Very practical question. Lots of answers, I should think, but it's not easy. So questions like these demand both empirical research and also some conceptual analysis. What do you mean by best way to translate? What's good? What do you mean by good? What do you mean by culture? What do you mean by status? And so on. So we also need other sorts of questions. We need, shall we say, theoretical questions or conceptual questions, which have to do with concepts and arguments, which lead to other kinds of hypotheses. So, what does translation quality mean? Would be an example of a theoretical question, a question about meaning, to which we can offer different sorts of answers also. What is the best way to define equivalence? Do we need the concept of equivalence? Can we manage without it? These are theoretical, conceptual questions. Are there different types of equivalence? Why should translators have a higher status? That's also a theoretical question, you could say, because it depends what you mean by status. What exactly is a translation anyway? Probably more has been written about that question than any other question in translation, except perhaps equivalence, I don't know. Is it even possible to find a universal definition? Most people these days seem to think, no, we don't actually have an agreed, completely universal concept. Do we have some technical problems still? Are we okay? Good. All right. So before we move now to actually look at some examples of translation hypotheses, I want to make one more point, which is that I think it's important to make a difference between what I call a hypothesis and what I call a claim. Did something happen to the sound then? Was that all right? Should I just stand still or sit down? Is it my walking about that does something? Am I lost? Not lost. Okay. I want to argue that there's a difference between these two terms. I want to say that I'm assuming that a hypothesis is something that we try to attack. We try to test it. Okay? You try to prove it wrong. And it's mostly used in the natural sciences, but it's increasingly used in empirical translation research. Whereas a claim is more used in traditional humanist studies, and claims are usually something to be defended. They're usually a bit less, they're less explicit, and they're usually something that people want to defend. So if you bear that in mind, you can then actually probably apply everything I will now say, or most of what I will now say, could be about hypotheses or about claims, depending on whether you want to attack it or test it, or whether you want to defend it, and depending on how explicit the statement is being formulated. I think we have three basic kinds of descriptive hypotheses, or claims, if you like. And then we have one kind of conceptual hypothesis. And I will give you examples of all these as we move on. So first of all, we have descriptive hypotheses, which are attempts to make a generalization about what something is. Then we have explanatory hypotheses, which are attempts to explain why something happens or why something is as it is. And then we have predictive hypotheses, which are guesses about what will happen under certain conditions. Those are the empirical ones, because they can all be tested and proved wrong. Examples coming in just a minute. Then we have the conceptual ones, which have to do with interpretation. An interpretive hypothesis is the idea that something can be usefully interpreted as something else. The important word is as. I'll come back to all these in a few minutes. This gives you just the general picture before we go on. So, we'll start with some descriptive ones. So we're going to be empirical, we're going to be descriptive, and we're going to be looking at the kinds of hypotheses which have been studied in translation theory over the last 20 years or so, which could be wrong, and probably are wrong in the form in which they are first proposed, at least. And the most common kind of such hypothesis concerns what we talk about usually as translation universals. That is to say, very general tendencies which are common to all translations. That would be the universal claim, that they are common to all translations of all kinds between all language pairs in all cultures at all times in history. Big claim. Okay, you might say you couldn't actually prove it wrong because we can't actually study the translations done in ancient Africa 5,000 years ago. True, we can't study those, so we can't perhaps prove it wrong. It usually means that it's been badly formulated, the hypothesis. We'll come back to that in a minute. Now, here's a very good example, which you may have heard of. It's been very much studied I think there must be at least 10 doctoral theses on this topic, on this hypothesis, that I have personally known about, and probably hundreds of articles on this same topic. And it's known as the explicitation hypothesis. And it claims, or argues, that translations tend to be more explicit than their originals. That they tend to make things, make information explicit in the translation, which were only implicit in the original text. So, to take a very, very simple invented example, if I tell you that there's an English text which says David Cameron has decided to resign, and this is translated into Latvian, it might say in Latvian, David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, has decided to resign. It's not true. Sorry, but it's not true. Sorry, I shouldn't walk out of the camera way, should I? I got too excited there. Where was I? Oh, yes. About being explicit, because you want to maybe give more information to the new readers that they might not guess. Of course, they would guess in that example. But okay, you get the idea, right? Is it true? What do you think? Is it true, shall we say, that translators tend to explicitate? Is it true that all translators of all kinds of text tend to explicitate? Because that's the way it was first formulated. Some of you are shaking your heads. I reckon it's probably not true universally, but it probably is true under certain conditions. So the next question is, when is it more likely to be true, and when is it less likely to be true? New doctorates coming up. Any ideas? Any suggestions for new doctorates? We need more research about this. We need to make it more specific. When do they explicitate? When do they not? For example, it's easy to think of whole kinds of translation where this is not true. For example, audiovisual translation, subtitling, you probably haven't got any space to explicitate because you're limited to the number of characters on the screen. So this is probably an exception. And you can probably think of others. I think there might be two sorts of universals, and I'll give you examples of both in just a minute. Some universals seem to have to do with differences between the source text and the target text, like explicitation that we just mentioned. And there are other kinds of hypotheses, which we'll just look at, which have to do with differences between translations and other texts in the target language which are not translated, like the idea that translations tend to be simpler than target language. So translations into Latvian might be, in some way, simpler than ordinary Latvian texts of the same kind. We can study this with a corpus. Now, let's look at some examples of each type. And I remind you that they are not facts and they may be wrong. One of the very oldest ones goes back at least to the 1950s. And this is the claim that translations are always longer than originals. True? Some people are nodding over this side, and over this side they're all shaking their heads. How do you manage that? When is it likely to be true? When is it likely to be not true? Any guesses? Yep. That's right. And in many legal texts, you have to keep to the same sentence breaks, don't you? You can't add another sentence somewhere because people get mixed up. Yeah, good point. So probably the answer to this is that no, it's not true generally, but it may be true of some language pairs in some circumstances. Not a very interesting one, perhaps. Some of the others are more interesting. Interference is, of course, a huge subject which has been written about enormously. Do you think it's true that every translation you've ever looked at has evidence of interference, regardless of language, regardless of language pair, regardless of translation type? If you looked hard enough and the text was long enough, would you find evidence of interference? You probably might, I should think. But is it the case for every single translation? Not quite sure. And there might be differences, too, in the way people reacted to this. Suppose there is interference, who cares? Does everybody care? Who doesn't mind and who minds? Lots of new research questions come out of this. As soon as you begin to ask the question, and you propose your answer, and you make your answer into a very general form, such as, yes, there's always interference, then you can easily be shot down by somebody who says, here is a text with no interference. Nah, so you were wrong. Or here is a text where I don't mind the interference. And you move off to more research questions. What about standardization? Do you think it's true that all translations use a more standardized language than their source texts? Not like the simplification I mentioned just now. Do all translations standardize the source text? You've got more doubters on this side of the room than this side of the room, I can see. Well, this has been studied also in a great many research projects. It's not clear. Perhaps it's very general, but when do we find it and when do we not find it? More questions there. This one seems to be more likely to me, that dialects do tend to get normalized. When you go from English into Latvian, for example, you have an English dialect. What happens to it in Latvian? Have you read Huckleberry Finn in Latvian? Some of you may have. It must be translated, I guess, into Latvian. There's Black English and there's Huck's English, which is not black, but it's kind of working class American English somehow. What happens to it in Latvian? I wonder. Be interesting to see. But they do tend to get normalized for obvious reasons. You could say that's a kind of standardization, maybe. Explicitation we just mentioned. Reduction of repetition. This is a strange thing. I think it may have to do with translator training, because it seems to be the case that there is a tendency that translators hate repetition. And even when the original says something 3 times in the same words for rhetorical effect, that the translator doesn't want to do this. And you drop one of them out, or you change it so that it sounds a bit different or something. I can see people nodding over here. We have on the right again. All right? You agree? You hate repetition. Why? Because it might be there on purpose. Why is there this tendency? This has attracted the attention, funnily enough, in Hungary. There are several Hungarian scholars who have made a reputation studying repetition in translation. You can see how you can make a reputation. Another one that's been studied a lot, that reported discourse, which can be quite complicated, tends to be simplified. I think in indirect free speech, for example, it tends to be merged so that you lose the ambiguity. It's no longer deliberately ambiguous between the narrator's voice and the character's voice. That would take more time to discuss than we perhaps have. And my last example on this list is the retranslation hypothesis, which may be familiar to some of you. It came up very briefly at coffee a few minutes ago, funnily enough. This goes back at least to Goethe. And after Goethe, a number of French scholars, for example, André Berman, and the claim here is that if you have the same text, say Hamlet, and it's being translated into the same language, say Finnish. I suppose Hamlet's been translated into Finnish maybe, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 times. I don't know. Probably several times anyway. The claim is that when the same text goes into the same target language the next time and the next time and the next time, what happens is that the text gets closer to the original. The translator gets closer to the original. So it begins by being very freely translated, and gradually it gets closer and closer and closer. as people accept more strangeness, you might say. The example we had just now was Alice in Wonderland into Latvian. And apparently the first translation was very localized, very naturalized, and some newer translation is not localized so much. So it contains more foreignness, more strangeness. Now, is this always true or just sometimes true? Again, I think it depends on a great many things. And it may be that plays are not typical because plays tend to get translated very freely for a new director who wants a new production of Hamlet. Maybe Hamlet's not a very good example. But this also generates questions. When does it seem to be true that repeated translations tend to get closer, and when does it not seem to be true that they tend to get less close? Now we look at some of the other ones, and I'll start with simplification because this was the result of the first big doctoral project in the 1980s which proposed and studied this idea of simplification in the University of Manchester by Sala Laviosa. And she found, when looking at a huge corpus of translations into English from lots and lots of source languages, millions of words, and she compared this corpus of translations to a corpus of similar English texts. Some were literature, some were newspapers, some were this, some were that, some were science, you know, the kind of mixture of different genres. And she tried to balance them all up. And then you do statistical tests on the different frequencies of different kinds of structures and different things that you can measure. So the computer does the work for you. And she discovered that, yes, the translators were simpler. And she picked out 3 particular ways in which they were simpler. That is to say, simpler than other target language texts of the same sort. Okay? We're not comparing with source language. We're comparing with other target language texts. Less lexical variety. So how many times did, how rich is the vocabulary? Okay? In the translations, the vocabulary seems to be less rich. There is more repetition of common items. Lexical density has to do with the measure between lexical words and grammatical words. So if a text is very dense, there will be fewer articles, fewer prepositions. It will be nouns and verbs and adjectives squished together in a compact structure. So if you say, when I had come, I had coffee, is not dense. But if I say, after coming, I had coffee, that's more dense because I haven't got when I had come. These little words get left out. And it becomes a non-finite structure, which is more dense. Again, just an invented example. So it seems that the translations are looser. They are not so dense as non-translations, which is quite interesting because there are things here that translators might think about. They might, for example, think, if it's true that translations tend to be not so dense, what can I do to my translations to make them a bit more dense so they would be more natural? And the third thing she found was that there was a much higher use of high-frequency items. So if you take the 100 most common words in English, they're even more common in the translations than they are in English anyway, which is a bit depressing too. It's something that translators might want to think about. Then there's something which some people call conventionalization, that translations tend to be more conventional than other not translated texts. But then you find something which goes against all this. You find, probably as a result of interference maybe, that in translations you find often bits which are not typical, are not natural. There's a wonderful word and a wonderful term used by one scholar, which is strange strings. Okay, I expect you know what that means. If you've done any editing, you look at a bit, you think, hang on, that combination doesn't quite work. It's a strange string, which of course is unusual because it's not found in the natural target language texts. So we find translations marked partly by being too usual and partly by being too unusual. This being unusual has to do with another specific hypothesis that was proposed originally by a Finnish colleague of mine, and it goes by the name of the unique items hypothesis. Here I have written target language specific items. That is to say, it appears that many languages have certain items or structures which are very typical to that language. In Finnish, for example, we have certain particles which go on the end of words, just to emphasize the word. Okay? But if you're translating from German or Russian or English or French, there's nothing quite in these languages which would make you think of using the particles, which are very common in Finnish. But when you look at the translations into Finnish, you find that the frequency of the particles is much less. Okay, because it's never occurred to the translator that he could use some of these special structures or special verbs or whatever. For example, in English, I have once been told by somebody who believed that one of the typical features of English is the ing form. You know, I was reading, for which there isn't an obvious corresponding form in some other languages. And this friend of mine went to look at a corpus of translations into English, and lo and behold, he found that the ing forms, there weren't enough of them somehow, not the amount that you'd expect. It's the same kind of thing. I wonder what they might be for Latvian, forms which were somehow underrepresented in translations. Not because they're terribly difficult, but because it simply hadn't occurred to the translator at that moment, because nothing in the source text actually stimulated, actually prompted it to come to his mind. Okay, now this sort of research I've been talking about, these descriptive hypotheses about general tendencies, this research has produced different sorts of reactions. Some people say, this is all complete nonsense, total waste of time. There can be no universals anyway. We can never prove they exist. For example, we can't actually go and check the translations in Africa 5,000 years ago, as we said a moment ago. And I suppose that's true. We can't actually ever test them universally. But maybe that means that we have chosen the wrong word. We shouldn't call them universals. That was a bad word to start with. When it was first proposed in the 1990s by Mona Baker and some other people, the idea is older than that, but she popularized the word, it then caught on. And nowadays everybody talks about translation universals. I have written about translation universals, and I wish I hadn't, because it's not a good word. It would be better to talk about general tendencies, something like that, or patterns, which is less absolute, I think. If you said there is a general tendency for such and such a thing to happen, then we don't have to go and look at Africa 5,000 years ago. The danger is when you say that what you think applies to everything, all translations. And that's what the word universal tends to, it takes us in the wrong direction. I think the word universal became popular because at the time it was proposed in the 1980s and so on, 1990s, linguists were looking for linguistic universals, which really were universal features of language, which they could test over all the languages. Now, there are perhaps 7,000 languages in the world, 6,000 or 7,000, depending how you count them. And you could, in theory, test every language. It would not be totally impossible to see, for example, does every language have nouns and verbs? Well, it probably take you several years, but you could check 7,000 languages. But you couldn't check 25 trillion translations. It's impossible, and we can't even find all the translations. So it's a bad term. Maybe we should just talk about tendencies. Other people say, all this research simply means that they're all bad translations. we're simply talking about quality. And you've been studying bad translations, and what you have found is simply general tendencies of bad translations. True or not? I'm not sure. Not perhaps true of all these hypotheses, because it's not the sign of a bad translation to explicitate. It's not the sign of a bad translation to normalize a dialect. There may be no other choice. It's not the sign of a bad translation to avoid repetition, depending on the norm in the target language for repetition tolerance, and so on. Some of them may be, but not all of them. I think the most important criticism is this one, which is that there's something wrong with all the corpora that we use. Now, nowadays, there are dozens of huge translation corpora which are available online in all kinds of language pairs, as you probably know. And if you have the computer skills and the statistical skills, you can check millions and millions of words of data to see whether such and such a feature is here or not here or whatever it is. But the trouble is that all these translations are more or less by definition translations which are available. So for example, nowadays many of them come from the EU, because all EU translations, or almost all of them, are available online. So you can study them. You can study Eurolex. The whole of European law is available in all the EU languages. You can go and study it. You can download it and you can count how many whatevers there are. And many of the scholars who do this work in literary translation, because you can take a novel and you can scan it, or maybe it's already online anyway, you have your electronic version and you can study it. But these are all fairly good translations. They're the top end of the translation scale. But what they don't represent is bad translations. Now, I have a question for you now. Is a bad translation a translation? On the left here? Yeah, on the right here? Come on, say no, please. No, no. Of course they're translations. But they just happen to be bad. I mean, a bad chair, this is a good chair, but a bad chair is still a chair, right? It just happens to be a bad chair. But we don't seem to have corpora of bad translations, or corpora which are mixed. So we need to have some quality idea built into the corpora. And so far, people haven't really done that. It would be rather interesting to know, is there a difference, for example, between what we find in good translations done by native speakers of the target language and, on the one hand, good translators done by non-native speakers of the target language, and then bad translations done by the two groups. Native speakers of the target language do not necessarily produce the best translations. It depends, of course. So, again, we need better corpora, or we should not claim universality. However, it is true that the kind of research which I've just now outlined certainly encourages good methodology. We have to have a hypothesis, we have to test it, and so on. We've discovered that some of them are more supported than others, yes, and we've learned a great deal about what makes translations different, what makes them special. Even if we don't now believe that some of the universal claims are really universal, we have used these claims in order to find out quite a lot about what makes translation special. And you could say this research suggests ways in which we could improve translations. Let's now move to another kind of descriptive hypothesis. We're still being empirical, and we're still being descriptive, trying to look at generalizations about what something is, how we can describe something, or what happens. I pick out an example here now which has to do with a process. This is also a fairly well-studied well-studied hypothesis, and it's known as the literal translation hypothesis. And it goes like this. In the translation process, that is to say, when you're sitting there at your computer and you've got the source text here, maybe on the screen, maybe on paper, and you're typing away, okay? In this process, this is the claim or the hypothesis, you tend to move from literal to less literal. course, we have to define what we mean by literal. Okay, we won't do that right now. Is it true that the first thing that comes into your mind when you translate is a literal version, pretty close, and then as you think about it, you might reject it, or when you come back later and revise it, you make it less literal? True? Not true? Now, what you should say, if you've been listening and concentrating, you should say, well, it depends. Now, come on, why aren't you saying that? Or I hope that's what you're thinking. All right? Under some conditions, this does seem to be the case. Very commonly, actually, this does seem to be the case. I'll refer a little later to some experimental work which seems to show this. But maybe not always, but we'll come back to it. If we find that our description, whatever it might be, our descriptive hypothesis actually is supported, whatever the general tendency might be that we're studying, we then have to move on and look for explanations. Let's look at a few explanatory hypotheses. Suppose we find evidence that translators don't like repetition, or that translators tend to explicitate, or whatever else we are looking at, or that they tend to start by being literal and then move to being non-literal. Where would we look for explanations? Well, you could say we might look at the translator's mind. We might look at cognition. How does a translator make decisions? How do we get inside the translator's mind? Well, we do have methods. You'll be surprised. We have methods of getting inside your mind. Electrodes and other things. You didn't take that picture, I hope. So we might look at cognition. More about that a little bit later too. We might look at the translator's concept of their role as cultural mediators, the way they're trained. What is their self-concept? We might, for example, look at their attitudes. We might look at their attitudes to risk. Are they good at taking risks, or do they not like to take risks? When do they take risks? We might look at other places too, but these are three sources where people have begun to look in the last decade or so. And I'll come back to them a little bit later today and tomorrow. We might also ask, are these general tendencies that we've been testing, our hypotheses, are they specific to translation? We've discovered that the answer may be not all types of translation, maybe just some types under some conditions, yes. But might they be actually applicable more generally? Not less generally, but more generally. Might they be not just true of translation to the extent that they are true? Could they be also true, for example, to anybody writing in the second language? In which case, they would not be specific to translation. So what is the level of generality at which we should position our arguments? Not clear. For example, there are scholars who argue that the kinds of things which I've been talking about as universals, these very general tendencies, are actually what you find in all kinds of mediating discourse. So if you say something to me, and then I go and say the same thing to her over there, I'm mediating your discourse. I might not be changing the language, but I would be mediating it somehow. And maybe some of the same things would occur. Maybe I would explicitate, for example. Or maybe I wouldn't repeat if you had repeated. If you said, I'm not coming, and I go and tell my friend over there, she says she's not coming. I probably don't say, she says she's not coming, she's not coming. I probably wouldn't say that, right? But so maybe this is generalizations at the wrong level. An example of some research on this has been done at the EU, the EU Parliament, where people have studied the transcriptions of the speeches. You know, if you make a speech in the EU Parliament, okay, you're probably reading something, but everything you say is transcribed by some super secretary, and then it's available for the public. So you have a written version of an oral speech, which may not be exactly the same as the original written speech. Are you following me? Are you keeping up with this? Okay. So you have a move across a medium. Same language, different medium, from spoken to written. Do you find some of these universals there? Answer, yes, you do. Okay? So maybe translation is not as special as we think it is. Maybe it's an example of something more general. Here's another explanatory hypothesis. Do you agree with this, I wonder? That translation quality can partly be explained by emotional factors. True? Always? Sometimes? Right. Well done. Yes, yes, you're getting it. Suppose you found yourself translating a legal text having to do with some awful type of crime that you knew that your great-grandmother was heavily involved in. Would your emotions, do you think, and you're very fond of your great-grandmother, would your emotions affect the quality of your translation? The answer is possibly, I think. That's an invented example, as you may have guessed. But there are examples like that, which have experimental examples like that. For example, there was an interesting case where interpreters were told to interpret a text about it raining. It was raining very hard in Athens or something. I'm inventing the detail. I don't remember. And then they were given an assignment to go to Athens. Actually, this is not quite an example, not the right one I'm looking at, because some interpreters took an umbrella, having just interpreted that it was raining in Athens. But that's the wrong way around. That shows that you have paid attention to what you were interpreting. No, sorry, cancel that. Can you scrub that off the tape? That doesn't that doesn't illustrate what I wanted to illustrate. Never mind. What about morning and afternoon? Now, this is more serious too. You probably know, do you, the research that's been done on American judges? Do you know this? About a year ago, there was a horrific piece of research done, which I think has relevance to this sort of issue. Do judges sentencing criminals who've been found guilty, do their sentences vary according to whether it's before lunch or after lunch? And the answer appears to be yes. Horrifying result. That in the morning, when the end of the morning, the judge is hungry, wants his coffee, hard sentences, 20 years, you know. After lunch, he's had a lunch, a couple of glasses of wine, oh, no problem, 6 months. I exaggerate. But this is a very disturbing result, if this is true, because it suggests that purely rational decisions can be affected by mood, and your mood is affected by what you eat, etc., etc. This, you could say, is something that you might try to control. Do you leave your hardest bits till after lunch, or before coffee, or after coffee? Do you somehow link the translation to your mood during the day? Do you think of your work process in terms of your mood variation? And if not, why not? That would be an interesting example for a seminar or something like that. This is the risk idea. Do you think this is true? Anthony Pym has been arguing for some time that risk avoidance, attitudes to risk, is a really interesting explanatory factor as to why translators behave as they do. Is it true that translators tend to choose something literal when they're not sure, what the hell does this mean? The answer is probably yes, but is it true that they do this because they want to avoid risk? So we have a descriptive claim. Do they do this? Answer, probably yes. Why do they do it? Well, do you think that's, do you believe that? Is that plausible to you? Do you choose a literal version to play safe? You don't want to risk being wrong. Is that a good explanation? Sometimes. So we would need to know when do you take the risk, when do you not? When do you think the risk is worth taking? Good point. Very good point. Yes, very good point. This is what Pim argues, that when the translator knows that the risk can be taken, then you take it. But if it's clearly, if you get this wrong, then the nuclear bomb will go off, then you probably don't take it. That's right. What about this one? Here's a prediction now. We're moving on to predictive hypotheses. One or two examples of this, or perhaps only one, I think. Oh no, there are two, yes. If you allow translators all the time they want, so no deadlines, these bloody deadlines, you have all cursed them, and so have I. If there are no deadlines, we'll produce much better translations, won't we? Why not? You've read How Says Research, have you? Yes? Well, better than when they have a deadline.
Yeah, but then again, that's pretty much perfection.
Yeah. But shouldn't we be perfectionists? It depends. Ah, okay, you got it. Okay, good. Yes. All right. So what this research, you actually probably confirmed the research, because what the research found was that there is a correlation between time and quality, but it's a bit like this. More time, better quality, more and more and more time, more and more and more time, and we have what you talked about. You keep making corrections that have no point, and things even get worse. Yeah. So one needs to know what's the optimum deadline. What is this optimum range here? When is it when you begin to go down again? Not easy to say, of course, but that's quite an interesting research problem, and also a problem for translation agencies. When do you stretch a deadline? When do you give them, another hour, another day, another 5 minutes, please? How strict is it? Interesting. I don't know the answers to those questions. Here's another predictive hypothesis, which will be understood at least by anybody who has ever trained translators. Our way of training translators is good. And our way of doing it will produce good translators, won't it? That's a prediction, right? We do this under these conditions, and this is what will happen, and yes, they will be good. Trouble is, it's not always tested, because it would be perhaps unfair, at least, to say, well, we're going to train you lot using this method and you lot using this other method, and we actually think this is not a good method. So we're going to do you this way, and we're going to do you that way. You might not be too pleased over here if you didn't get trained so well. So it would have to be done under quite strict ethical conditions. But basically, you make a prediction. When you set up your course structure or your training structure, you are making a prediction, a hypothesis. And you might be wrong. Notice, it is a hypothesis, and you might be wrong. It might be that some other way of training would actually be better than your way. Okay, now we move to the other chunk, which is concepts. And I want to give some little time to this. It won't be so long as what we've been talking about so far, so this is a shorter section. I think they're very important, but I think they're very misunderstood. Therefore, I want to give them some status. Now, an interpretation is different from an empirical hypothesis because an interpretive hypothesis can never be proved wrong. If I say to you, I see translation always as bananas, you can't tell me, no, they're not bananas. I could say, well, I see them as bananas. I see distinct similarities between translations. I won't go into them, but I mean, I could justify it. If I had half an hour, I could explain precisely why I think bananas is a very good way of thinking about translation. And you would probably disagree. I don't see it like that, you would say. So you say you have a different interpretation. But you cannot in any way prove that my interpretation is false. It's not empirical. It's just the way I see it. You might be able to say, my interpretation is completely useless. Yes, it would be, that example. I think totally useless. It doesn't generate any interesting research questions. Well, you can slip on a banana skin, I suppose, yes. I'm thinking now, maybe there's something more in it than I thought, I'm not sure. But the question is, how useful are they? They're basically agreements. If I spoke to you now for 3 or 4 hours, you've got time, haven't you? We can surely stretch till midnight. And at the end of that time, if you were all convinced that, yeah, I think he's probably right, I think translations actually should be seen as bananas, and we could go and spread this message throughout Latvia, we might, in fact, gradually generate a new consensus. I think it would be less likely, so I'm not going to try. But this is the way, surely, we accept or don't accept an interpretation. So the question is, how useful are they? What follows from them? Now, I've already given you one, because I suggested to you that there were 2 kinds of universals, right? My 2 kinds of universals. It's not a fact, notice. It's my interpretation. I see a lot of things. Look at that picture behind you. That would be a good example. If you turn around, look at that picture. Okay? I see a lot of universals there. Sorry, I'm moving out of camera range again. And that picture's, by the way, for those who are not here, the picture's got lots of blobs in different positions. Quite an interesting, curious picture with a group here and a group there and some space there and so on. Maybe that could be added in later. Okay, now, if I said to you that picture really could be broken down into two sorts, or maybe 3 sorts, you could say, well, yeah, possibly, yeah, I can see there could be a 3 there, or maybe this side and that side or something. But it's my interpretation, it's my way of seeing the universals, okay? It's an interpretation. So it might not be a fact. Many people have found it useful, I have been pleased to notice. Many people talk about Chesterman's S universals, and it's great because they like it then and they use it, and so on. So that's good. But it's not a fact. And then there's this other kind. I mean, I wonder, would you agree with these? Here are some more traditional interpretive hypotheses. That translation can be understood as building a bridge between cultures. This is the good way to think about translation. Yes? Most people are nodding. Not quite sure, somewhere in the middle there. That suggests that translations are always good and nice and do good things, right? Well, you can also do really nasty things with translations, can't you? Yes, you can. They're not always nice bridges. Suppose you lived in Brazil 20 years ago, and you were studying translation, you would be indoctrinated with the idea that translation is cannibalism. As you probably know, some of you, that we eat the source text, and we chew it up, and we spit it out, and we do with it just what we like. And we take all the energy from the source text, and it's food for us, and we are just cannibals. That's what we do, and we have the power. This is kind of anti-colonialist feedback, you know? This is a strongly felt belief, a strongly felt interpretation in many parts of the world. Would you agree with that? Are you cannibals? Translation cannibals? Yes? A nice yes over there somewhere. Good. Or do you think that you're being an artist? I mean, do you interpret translation as an artistic performance? Many people would like to think that. You probably have all kinds of metaphors, but they're interpretations. They're neither right nor wrong. They're either useful or not useful. Even within translation theory, when we begin to find typologies, and people say, well, there are 2 sorts of equivalence, or 5 sorts of equivalence, as Kohler said. I think if somebody says, well, really, there are 27 types of equivalence, people will begin to say, hang on, that's far too complicated. I'm not going to bother with 27. And it wouldn't be very useful. So the question is, how useful are they? What kind of generalizations can you make? What kind of interesting categories can you make with these things? I quite like Ricoeur's study of identity. This is French philosophy. You know, of course, that you have 2 identities, don't you? The idem and the ipse. Yes? Yes? I hope so. The idem, meaning that bit of you which remains the same from your childhood onwards, your inner core, and you look at this picture of you when you were 2, and you say, well, that's me. And then you're still you now, because it's remained the same. And the ipse, according to Ricoeur, is that which makes you different from everybody else. So it's you and not you. So it's what separates you from the others. And the idem is what connects you to your past. Now, I thought that was quite useful. I've used that, and I think that's quite an interesting interpretation of the concept of identity. If you don't like it, don't use it. If you do like it, it may stimulate thought. It's not a fact, notice. It's not empirical. It's just a way of conceptualizing a difficult abstract idea, the idea of identity. Well, translation is also a pretty difficult idea. There is a Norwegian philosopher who's had a lot of influence on me, whose name is Dagfinn Føllesdal. He writes both in Norwegian and German and English. He teaches in Norway and in Stanford in America. He writes about philosophy of science. And he's written a great deal about interpretive hypotheses. And he argues that this kind of hypothesis that we're now talking about, conceptual hypotheses, really show that the method of research in the humanities is just like the method of research in the natural sciences, because often people think there's a huge difference between these two. And he argues that there isn't such a difference, and I would agree. The only difference is that in the human sciences, in humanities, we're arguing a lot about meaning. What does identity mean? What does translation mean? What does equivalence mean? These are all conceptual questions. And we don't often test them enough. We simply throw out an idea and we don't test it. And it's never criticized enough. I think in the natural sciences, there's much more, excuse me, much more emphasis on testing a hypothesis. They're usually empirical, of course, there. And for us, I think we should pay more attention to considering actually what the, how to test the usefulness of the conceptual hypotheses that we play with. It's also worth remembering that whenever we test an empirical hypothesis, such as do translators hate repetition, or do they tend not to reproduce repetition, put it more correctly, in order to test that, we need some conceptual analysis. We need to know precisely what we mean by repetition. Do you mean structural or semantic or both or whatever? Repetition can be analyzed in quite complicated ways. It's not a simple concept. Or if you're measuring quality, you need to say, well, I will interpret quality as something, something, something. You need a definition of it. And to make your definition, you need conceptual analysis. So we can't do very much with purely empirical hypotheses without bringing in these conceptual things, which I have called interpretive hypotheses. I think they're extremely important. This is a point that I mentioned briefly before. It's probably a bit in the wrong place here, never mind. So how general is the hypothesis? Do we mean it's universal for everybody or not? Well, I think most of the totally universal hypotheses that have been made are so universal that they are pretty trivial. They don't carry much meaning. If you say, well, is it true of all translations everywhere that there are shifts, there are changes of some kind? Well, yeah, there is. I mean, I suppose that's pretty obvious. It's so obvious it's boring. It doesn't tell us any more information. Maybe we could, it's more meaningful if we make the claim or the hypothesis less general. So it's not probably true that translations always use more slang, but is it true that fan-subbing translations, you know fan-subbing? When you have these groups of people who get together and translate a film or a comic strip just for fun and help each other and so on, they probably do use more slang than professionals. It's quite interesting to see that. Or we can condition it, maybe that translators using a translation memory system actually split up the text differently. They think in different sized chunks. That has certainly been shown. And then what do you mean by a tendency? Okay. I'll end up with a few comments on what makes a hypothesis interesting. And I'm going to come back to this literal translation hypothesis that we talked about before. And I'm going to argue that there are some reasons why this is really an interesting, significant hypothesis, and one reason why it is not interesting. See what you think. One reason why it is interesting is that it can be tested in so many ways. I won't go through all these, but these all refer to different sorts of research techniques: think aloud protocols, keystroke logging, analysis of revision or temporary solutions, what happens when people correct themselves in interpreting, how do people translate idioms, interference, and what happens when people translate under time stress with a very short deadline. These are all different sorts of experimental conditions, and all the research that's been done on these sorts of work has shown support for this hypothesis. It does seem to be true that people tend to go from literal to less literal as they think. One more interesting reason why it's significant is because it goes against other hypotheses. If the literal translation hypothesis is right, then certain other hypotheses are wrong, which is very interesting because it puts it into a position of conflict. For example, the deverbalization hypothesis, which is the basis of the Paris School of Interpreting, or has been for about 25 years, that is to say that interpreters, as soon as they hear the incoming message, they immediately extract the meaning from the form, they deverbalize, and then when they speak the message in the target language, there's no connection to the source form. It's abstracted from meaning. This is their belief. Now, if the literal translation hypothesis is right, then that belief cannot be true, because the literal hypothesis assumes that the form of the source language influences the choices, influences the cognition, the cognitive process. And it also goes against Neider's model of translation, which I won't go into now, where he assumes that you cross a river leaving the form behind on one side of the river. You cross the river, and then you simply restructure your new set of meanings out of the new language, also assuming that you leave the form behind. Maybe both these deverbalization model and Neider's model are both talking about ideal good translation or interpreting. But that may be a very different claim to what really happens, and even what really happens with professional interpreters. It's different to say this is an ideal, and on the one hand, and to say this is what professionals actually do on the other hand. And this would also be related, to, of course, to interference, which has been also much studied. It can be applied. A third reason why it's an important hypothesis, it's been applied, can be applied to many sorts of research and practical problems, training, and so on, so on, so on. I won't go through those right now again. But there's one reason why it's not very interesting, which is that it's pretty obvious. It's pretty intuitive. It doesn't actually surprise anybody unless you happen to be a deverbalization fan or a Neider fan, in which case you might not like it. But it's very cautious because it seems so obvious. I think that's a minus point because it doesn't bring in any really interesting, surprising new information. However, even as a descriptive hypothesis, the fact that if it's true that translators tend to begin literal and then move away, it's quite interesting from the point of explanation because it connects, unifies different sorts of observations. It allows you to generalize connections with other hypotheses, and it assumes something about the cognitive process, which then brings in causality. These are basic methods of explaining something, unifying or generalizing or looking at causes. It might also not be just true of translation, but it might extend to second language acquisition and so on. So, last slide. My conclusions are that hypotheses are extremely useful. They are research tools, they are thinking tools, conceptual tools for making a claim and an argument explicit and testable, and opening them up to counter evidence. And we would come back to the place we started with, the idea that knowledge is fallible and you might be wrong. If you make a claim in a form which is easy to shoot down, then let's shoot it down and then let's see what we can learn from it. If you say all translators tend to explicitate and we find a group of translators which do not explicitate, then that's interesting and we've learned something. So What would make you change your mind is a really big question, a good question. Okay, you might say that the tests may have their flaws too, so you need to criticize the tests and test the tests. It gets quite complicated there. And my second conclusion would be, yes, some hypotheses are certainly more interesting than others, more significant than others. And there may be many that I have not thought of including here, which you yourself find extremely interesting, potentially interesting. And if there are, now might be a good time to spend 1 or 2 minutes just proposing them. Are there other hypotheses that you would like to know about, to like to ask, have these been studied, or which you've thought about yourself and which sound interesting? So let me give you the floor for a few minutes. I'll just put some references there in case anybody wants them, but they will be on these files that come to you. These slides will come to you anyway at some point. So I'll stop there, and I will invite questions and comments, and indeed questions about other possible sorts of hypotheses which I haven't mentioned would be interesting to hear about. So, over to you. Or any other questions or comments? Okay. Yeah.
Professor, thank you very much. When you mentioned retranslation, I have just remembered Nabokov and his translation of his works from Russian into English and then back to Russian, as that English version translated into Russian. So now I'm thinking, well, the hypothesis, what that retranslation result would be. Whether he used the same codes or whatever, which he used firstly in the original.
Nabokov's view of literary translation was unusual because he insisted on very, very literal translation. And he said that the good literary translation should have footnotes, which are like skyscrapers at the bottom of every page. I don't know what he did to his translations of his work in English back into Russian. I don't read Russian, but I have seen some of his ones from Russian into English, and they are indeed very unusual. They are not typical, I would say, certainly. Would you think that, yes, what would your impression be if you have studied them both ways? What is your feeling about these translations?
You know, I think that when hadn't he been a translator, most probably he wouldn't have become the writer as he was. I think that his method of writing was determined by his translations.
Ah.
In fact, yeah? And through translation and retranslation, he developed his style of writing. That might be also.
I don't know. I'm not by any means a Nabokov scholar. That's an interesting point. I don't know. I do know that self-translation, auto-translation, has been quite a topic of interest for a number of scholars in the last decade or so. There have been doctoral theses working on people like Beckett, Samuel Beckett, who wrote both in French and in English and translated himself both ways. And there are Canadian writers who write both in French and English. And there's an Italian guy, I don't remember all the names now, who writes in Italian and French, I think. And there are people who in Spain who write in Spanish and Catalonian and translate themselves both ways. And it poses very difficult and different theoretical questions about what is your role when you are translating your own text.
And the purpose even,
yes,
why do you do that?
Yes. I haven't made a detailed study of these things, but it is a whole separate, it's a special area, I think. It's a special form of translation scholarship that focuses on this. And it's always literary. I don't know of work on non-literary texts which have been self-translated in this way. Yeah, yes, I don't know enough about Nabokov to be able to answer that. Anybody else would like, probably knows Nabokov better than me? No? Okay. Any other points anybody would like to raise? If not, maybe we just take a pause, take a break. There are some people who came from Kaunas, I think, who might want to just say hello especially. So there's a space between this talk and the next one, so there's a space for that now, if you like. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.